My number 4 best chess game of the 1920s is Miguel Najdorf versus Gliksberg. Now, you might think that I just said Gliksberg, which is the player that Najdorf beat in the Polish Immortal, an incredible game with a spectacular combinative finish. But no, I actually just said Gliksberg. Evidently, Najdorf managed to win 2 of his most brilliant games in the span of a year against players with almost identical names. Many have speculated it was the same player and there's a misspelling, but evidence seems to be that they were genuinely different players. In this game, Najdorf sacrifices almost all of his pieces for a speculative attack that culminates in a spectacular checkmate. Najdorf begins with pawn to e4, and his opponent selects the French defense, pawn to e6. The French defense is basically my first legitimate opening on the black side, so I have a lot of nostalgia for the French defense, and I really do love the opening. But I do have to concede that there does seem to be a lot of brilliance on the white side. The latest example is Karyakin versus Shankland from the FIDE World Cup. This example continues with d4, d5, knight c3, d takes e4, knight takes e4, knight d7, knight f3, knight g to f6, bishop d3, bishop e7, castles, b6, knight e5. Now, it seems like both players are playing incredibly naturally, and here white is naturally threatening knight to c6, and black plays bishop b7. What could be more natural? Well, it turns out that even if all of this stuff is natural, it's now also decisively in white's favor. Black needed to improve at a couple of points, for example, by eliminating the knight on e5. At this point, Najdorf can already commence the brilliance with knight takes f7. Beautiful and, according to Stockfish, decisive. But to a human player, it's not so clear right away. After king takes f7, some things are clear. Knight g5 check, and you can't go back to f8, or you really don't want to because of a royal fork. That hurts. And you also don't want to come back to e8 because now the queen and the g7 pawn are under attack. That hurts. But is the position really lost after king g8? Now, I would not necessarily know that if I didn't have Stockfish telling me yes, it is. After knight takes e6, queen c8, moving the attack queen and defending the c7 pawn, I don't see an immediate decisive continuation for white. I'm sure that an attacking player like Tao would tell me that intuition is enough to know that this position is already decisive, and also a calculating beast like Stockfish tells me the same. And if we look a little bit deeper here, we can see that after, for example, rook e1, the computer's suggested move, white intends things like bishop c4, like bishop to f4. The queen and rook will come into play along the e-file or potentially somewhere else. And black has a lot of questions to answer, like how am I defending my very, very weak light squares? How am I evicting this very, very strong knight on e6? How am I dealing with the long-term safety issues of my king? These are all very legitimate questions, and in this case, there are no legitimate answers. White is simply winning according to Mr. Stockfish. So, unfortunately for Mr. Najdorf, he did not go for this, but fortunately, he will get another opportunity for brilliance after knight takes f6. Black has a conundrum. How do you recapture? In this position, you don't want to go knight takes because of bishop b5 check, and the check is not easily met. And you might think, if you're a French player, that you don't want to go bishop takes f6, because you never put the bishop on f6 in the French defense. Why would you ever do that? It's just so unnatural. But even if it's unnatural, there's nothing wrong with it here. I can't recall seeing a bishop on f6 in very many French positions, none like this, but it's totally valid. And there's nothing wrong with the black position here. It turns out that black probably has an even game. Unfortunately for Mr. Gliksberg, though, after knight takes, he went for pawn takes f6. And now knight takes f7 is played and has only been strengthened. This piece sacrifice does lead to a winning attack, although there are some twists and turns ahead. King takes f7, queen h5 check. The king pulls back to g8, and now rook e1, developing the rook, threatening rook takes e6, and maybe also thinking about rook lifts at some point. The knight pulls back to f8. There's nothing better, holding on to e6 and also covering this square in some lines. And now, in this position, Najdorf has a decisive continuation. Of course, the computer is always quick to point this out, but for humans, things aren't so clear. Bishop h6. Now, this is a natural move because it's threatening, among other things, queen g4 check with ideas of taking on e6 or going into g7. And if I had to guess, maybe Najdorf didn't go for this because of queen d5, offering the queen trade and attacking g2 and threatening mate. When you've just sacrificed a piece, you don't really want to go for the continuations where it's your opponent that threatens mate and offers a queen trade. But here, after queen g4 check, knight g6, then you can simply take on e6. There's now the idea of bishop takes g6 and rook takes e7, and there's no good defense for black. This would be winning according to Mr. Stockfish. So, unfortunately for Najdorf, he didn't find the immediately decisive continuation, but fortunately for us, he did go for something speculative and beautiful. He goes for rook takes e6, and I love this move. It's not the decisive move. Black can defend, but it's very, very thrilling as a chess fan. This rook sacrifice leads to some spectacular lines, and it's very difficult for black to defend. Knight takes e6 is now forced, and bishop c4. This pin is very uncomfortable. There are now ideas like queen g4 check, and ideas of simply playing bishop h6 and rook e1. White's continuations are so natural, and black's defense, while available, is not so intuitive. In this position, probably the most natural and successful defense, I think, is queen d7. Now, it's important to note that there is never any real risk for white because you have queen g4 check. The king needs to defend this and get out of the check, so king f7 is forced. Queen h5 check, and the king needs to step back, and you don't want to step into one of these checks on the dark squares, so king g8 and queen g4 check. And white always has this perpetual. White doesn't have more than this perpetual because black has defensive ideas like bishop back to f8 and then rook over to e8. And these defensive ideas are really effective for black. There's not enough firepower left on the white side of the board. White is down a knight and a rook after all, that white can really finish black off after bishop h6 and rook e1. White's risking nothing. White has the perpetual check, but white does not have more than that after queen d7, bishop f8, rook e8, for example. So in the game, though, black goes for queen d6, which is also enough to hold, but it's a little more difficult, I think, for black in this position. And the problem is that queen d7, while it might not seem like a good idea to put the queen on a light square and to potentially interfere with a move like bishop c8, trying to hold on to the e6 knight, the queen on d7 would have covered e8 and allowed rook e8 later. Now there is no rook e8, and it turns out that that matters in some critical lines. White now continues with bishop h6, and there's the idea of queen g4 check, queen g7 check, and then queen takes f8. How are you to meet that? Well, the answer turns out to be rook d8, which is a great move. It's also, I think, a very difficult move, because now after queen g4 check and then king f7, white can go win a rook. But remember that white was down more than a rook, so winning the rook is not enough. And after king e8, in fact, white has gone too far, and white should have taken the perpetual, because picking up the rook now leads to a position where the queen is under attack, black's king is getting away and is in fact safe. And after, for example, queen takes h7, black starts to gain the initiative. Queen c6 threatens the bishop and threatens mate. And after bishop f1, black can start to make improving moves like queen e4, offering a queen trade, which, as we've already indicated, is something Najdorf definitely doesn't want. As a result, the best and really only defensive idea was rook d8. Instead, black goes for bishop f8. What could be more natural, pulling the bishop back and trying to exchange off the bishop on h6? But after bishop f8, we get rook e1. And as already indicated, there is no rook e8 because the queen is not on d7. So the defense here is bishop c8. And it seems like this should hold everything together. But now queen e8. The queen invades, and there are threats to e6 and threats to f8. There is no defense for white, and the computer now says plus 20. Bishop d7, attacking the queen, defending e6, and saying to white, hey, please take the rook on a8. In fact, if white takes the rook on a8, the game is not over. But there is a better move for white, and I encourage you to pause your video and try to find it. Well, Najdorf plays rook takes e6. Beautiful and brilliant, and mate in 3. The light squares are cleared away, and it is going to be checkmate. If the rook on e6 is captured, my favorite checkmate is not taking with the bishop, although that does it. I'd certainly want to play queen takes e6 instead, so I could finish with this amazing 2-bishop checkmate. Absolutely stunning. Instead, though, black takes the sacrificed queen on e8. It doesn't matter which way black captures, but black does capture with the rook. The rook finally moves out of the corner. One of the rooks finally moves out of the corner. This rook doesn't ever get to. And now rook takes e8, discovered check from the bishop. The bishop blocks, and now bishop takes e6. Queen takes e6, and of course, we're not taking the queen when we would actually be losing. We are taking on f8, and it's checkmate. The final position is just so claustrophobic. The king never got out of his box, and the rook never got out of the corner. The rook has had no moves for the last X number of moves, and it still has no moves. I hope that you've enjoyed this beautiful miniature from Najdorf. What do you think? Is it even better than the Polish Immortal? Well, whatever your opinion, if you want to see more of my favorite chess games of the 1920s, simply click on the playlist that is popping up on your screen as I speak.